Welcome, everybody. Today, we are going to continue our book review series of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, Chapter 11. I was noticing in my notes I made some incorrect statements last session, so I wanted to correct those. And furthermore, I wanted to build on our main thesis, or Howard Zinn's thesis, in this chapter, where I think it really finally it's kind of gets solidified, which is what I was trying to tell you the last couple times. So, excuse me, let me get my notes correctly. So as I stated earlier, I'll be going kind of hopefully chronologically, starting on the teacher's edition of 187. Your page numbers are different. So you're reading out of this book. I use this teacher's edition right here. There it is right there, the gray one. Okay, so one of the moral of the story is in this chapter, really, we're going to talk about how the economic growth and the population growth of the United States in the latter half of the 19th century, or the 1800s, was the greatest march of economic growth in human history. However, it was at the expense of the common person. By 1887, you had advancements in manufacturing and technology. You have the meat packing industry being born, where you combine the railroad with the ice truck. So now you can ship anything really across the United States and it wouldn't spoil. So you can now have meat packing industry. Before that, you didn't have this type of transportation. You had to take the animal, chicken, pig, cow, to where it needed to be slaughtered, and it had to be consumed in that area. So you also have the cattle industry rising, and it started in California, and it soon took over in Texas. And you had, I don't know if you know that movie with Billy Crystal, what is it? But it's all about this, driving cattle from place to place. So this kind of moment in history where we have these huge cattle drives. But, actually it didn't last too long. But there is this period where it's kind of, you know, glorified or celebrated in movies. And you also have this idea of the small farmer now being displaced by the mechanization of agriculture. And you have the railroads being built. This is also the moment in time where the railroad industry is kind of at its height. So the Transcontinental Railroad was finished in 1869. That was when the Union Pacific Railroad and the Central Pacific Railroad met, I believe, in Utah, if my memory serves correctly. I live in San Diego. This was kind of the end of the line, pun intended, where I believe by the 1880s, late 1870s, where that Transcontinental Railroad connected from San Francisco down into Los Angeles and then San Diego. So this is important to remember how important or how central the railroad was to this moment in history, to not only commerce, but transportation. Then you had this flood of people come. So San Diego, where I'm at, again, it's the end of the line in many ways. By the 1880s, you had a rush of speculators and people coming from the East Coast. And San Diego is a relatively new city historically. Both railroads used, and this is the moment in time where there's a term called robber barons. So you have, and it's a derogatory term, but what it was really about was milking the system. And this was the beginning of the welfare state to some extent. And the welfare state meaning to help out those rich become richer. And a lot of the Transcontinental Railroad was through the blood, sweat, and tears of the immigrants, largely Chinese immigrants. And they were just basically dispensable. And not only Chinese immigrants, so the Central Pacific Railroad, for example, used around 10,000 Chinese immigrants. and 3,000 Irish immigrants. Irish immigrants were on the bottom of the barrel, so to speak, of the white caste system. So you have the first immigrants who came to America were English. I'm, for example, mostly English. And then as you have these other wave of English immigrants, excuse me, you have a kind of a tier system of, who is more American, more civilized, etc. And on that bottom of that tier system, you have the Irish, unfortunately. And the Central Pacific would pay $1 a day, dollar or two a day, and it was truly a heist of the system itself. You had 9 million acres given to the Central Pacific Railroad. You had 12 million acres given to the Union Pacific as they bribed Congress people to keep quiet. And again, this was all at the expense of the common person. Both railroads used long twisting routes to get more subsidies, so that instead of going a straight line, they would go around, the where they wouldn't have to, and then they would get more subsidies, more land, by making a more circuitous route. And so, yes. And at this point in time, the JP Morgan. So again, I made a couple of wrong statements last chapter 10. So actually it wasn't Vanderbilt, it was JP Morgan who was the one who dodged the Civil War by paying the $300 draft deferment, where you would pay a substitute to go in your place. And he sold defective rifles during the Civil War, where the owner of the rifle would shoot off their thumb. So, this is why people really aren't a big fan of people like JP Morgan, especially those who are in the military. I would think you would have a problem with that. Just like Rockefeller and Carnegie and Mellon, all these rich, wealthy people would just pay off. They didn't go fight the war because there was this $300 draft deferment where you have someone else go in your stay. And so you had at this point JP Morgan consolidating. So 4 out of the 6 railroad systems. And this is where the word monopoly comes from. If anyone's used, that's why when you play the game Monopoly, my family plays it. We actually played it yesterday or day before. It has the railroads on it, has utilities, it has all the properties. So a lot of that game actually comes out of this historical moment in time, where the term monopoly was coined. So Morgan linked railroad to railroad, all the banks. So at this point, you have banks, railroads, insurance companies all combining. By 1900, Morgan controlled half of all the railroads. Rockefeller at this point in time was also made, or someone say self-made. I would maybe use a different term. Rockefeller was a bookkeeper. He started at an oil refinery. Then he immediately started the Standard Oil Company, which 1870 and crushed all competition. What Rockefeller did was he basically made it more efficient. The idea of at this point everyone was on kerosene, so he used the natural. I think kerosene is a natural gas, and he became basically, by linking the railroad to the kerosene to the refineries, he basically crushed his competition because he could do things way more efficiently and way more cheaper. And so Rockefeller would eventually become the wealthiest. But when it comes to Morgan, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, I mean, you're talking about, it's like, basically they controlled the vast majority of industry. At this point, you have Carnegie pioneering steel in America. And he was, one of the things that's problematic with this time in history, you have them, using Congress to protect their like, for example, Carnegie used tariffs to protect himself and make steel more expensive for the average person. And this is also at the point of the rise of cities. So without steel, you don't have the creation of New York and all these cities. So all this moment in time, this would be considered the apex of the American empire. You have the rise of cities, you have all these variables coming together to create what we call today America. Cells to and then you have the kind of a back and forth. I'm looking at my notes, excuse me. Okay. And again, I'm trying to keep these under 30 minutes, but the moral of the story was, in this part of my notes, is that at this point in time, you have these robber barons really being in cahoots with the politicians, creating tariffs, keeping out foreign steel, closing off domestic competition, and keeping prices high and wages low, with extremely long hours, such as 12-hour days. So, and this is something Zinn calls that these were the first beneficiaries of the welfare state. So you think of welfare state as like poor people, but the welfare state can also be considered something for rich people too. And we have that, for example, we have no contract bids in the Department of Defense currently. So that would be a contemporary example. The first monopolies were telephone and telegraph. And at this point in time, you have banks and corporations being interlocked. JP Morgan, Rockefeller. For example, Morgan sat on 48 boards. Rockefeller sat on 38 corporate boards. And you have Karl Marx kind of predicting this in the Communist Manifesto, where you have ultimately everything is starting to protect the interest of the rich. Whether Democrat or Republican, it didn't matter. The national policy would not change in any important way. Now, this is really one of the fundamental points in Zinn's book, is that there is never fundamental change, no matter who is in power, Democrat, Republican, because they may promise something. Hey, I'm going to do this. I'm going to break monopolies like in this time. But then when they get in power, when I say they, I mean politicians, presidents, congresspeople, senators, they don't do anything. So this is the one constant in American politics, where we are constantly protecting and serving the interests of the rich while pretending to be neutral. And this is to maintain order. And what you'll see later on, especially, is that actually in this chapter, is that when one of the biggest fears was, revolts from the working class, and we have that actually in this chapter. So you have the Interstate Commerce Act, which was supposed to regulate the railroad, but instead it became in cahoots with the business executives and politicians. You also have the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was again, antitrust is like a monopoly breaker, or something against, so you don't have a monopoly. This was made harmless by the Supreme Court. And one of the things I really like about Zinn is when he talks about the Supreme Court and all these factors, like the law, was that like the legislators, that these people were the ones doing the bidding for the elite, because the Supreme Court, for example, is chosen by the president, it's ratified by the Senate, and it's from the upper class. So you have no real representation from the lower class in any branch of government, including the Supreme Court. So that's why they make laws that will benefit them. Because what happens, when people get out of politics, what do you think happens? They go to they use these relationships they fostered, and then they get more wealthy after they're done with politics. Okay, so 14th Amendment was used not for blacks, but to protect corporations. Okay, and I'm going to try to go fast. I could actually spend probably quite a bit of time on this, but I'm not going to. I'm going to try to get to the core themes. Okay. So one of the things he talks about in this portion is, in America we have these kind of golden gooses, or these pillars that are that will never change no matter what. Again, we talked about this idea of protecting the interests of the rich. The other is protecting the interests of private property. So we have this quote by Blackstone Commentaries, and the Founding Fathers reads, actually the Founding Fathers read Blackstone Commentaries. The Blackstone Commentaries is the source. So great is the regard for law for private property that it will not authorize the least violation of it. No, not even for the common good of the whole community. So private property is a pillar of American society, where at the expense of the common good, we will protect it. The other thing that he talks about in this chapter is the myth of the rags to riches story. So we have this idea in the American mind of where if you're wealthy, it's because you deserved it. You worked your butt off. You saved. You weren't frivolous. You know, it's this idea of the self-made man or woman, and that's actually a myth perpetuated by the rich. So, you know, and it's basically, you know, this idea of being wealthy is a sign of superiority, and a sign of poor. If you're poor, it's a sign of personal failure. And that the only way to climb up, a poor person to climb the ladder is by extraordinary effort and extraordinary luck. Um, and so one of the books I like to tell students about is this book. It's called Anti-Intellectualism in American Life by Richard Hofstadter. Now, this book really goes to the core theme of that idea of where it comes from, this idea of basically our understanding of the business person. And it really it's a philosophical book, and it's a philosophical understanding and it actually came to fruition recently with the COVID crisis, where the American worships the business person and as more as the highest of any accomplishment. So it's this idea of materialism and wealth being the ultimate goal, and that really representing how, you know, hard you've worked, and being more important than even, you know, learning or being an intellectual. And one of the reason why this book's called Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, because that idea was at the expense of the expert, at the expense of the intellectual, at the expense of you know, just having knowledge, because just having knowledge wasn't really valued. And one of the interesting things that he talks about in this book was when the founding fathers came here, um, they were all educated in England, very, very intelligent people in Oxford and Cambridge. And these our founding fathers, you know, who we hold so high, and, you know, Declaration of Independence, were extremely intellectual. And some would say some of the smartest men that ever lived. And that's a little dramatic for me, but I'm just saying that's how we kind of view the founding fathers. Don't get me wrong, very, very intelligent. Madison, Jefferson. I mean, they're brilliant writers and thinkers and political scientists. But as you go west onto the frontier, you start losing that, and the business person starts to become the most important aspect of American society. That's fast forward to 2016. It's it shouldn't surprise anyone that we have a business person as a president, where everyone wants to see, you know, I'm tired of these politicians, let's get a business person up there. That really is one of the most American things that I can think of. And it could be in a way predicted by Hofstadter in the 70s. I think this won an award for one of the, I think, Pulitzer or something like that. But anyways, I can stay on that, but I just want to introduce that idea. So at this point in time, the rich become known as philanthropists, given huge amounts of money to education. You have Stanford, for example. Stanford was part of the Pacific, one of the railroad companies on the West Coast. Pacific, I guess it's Pacific, right? Cornell, Vanderbilt, Duke, Carnegie, these are all philanthropists. So people don't realize that these are common names, but these are actually people that during this era. And at this point in time, and as an educator, this is kind of speaks to me. These educational institutions were created to perpetuate the system. It did not encourage dissent, but teachers, doctors, lawyers, administrators, politicians were paid to keep the system of oppression going. These were buffers against trouble. So you have public schools, for example, teaching obedience and patriotism to authority. By the mid to late 1800s, high schools developed as aids to the industrial system. In fact, high schools were created to to basically lower the unemployment rate. At this point in time, 1/6 of all employers were under 16, were children. So high school became mandatory largely as an aid. That was the primary reason for high school, to get these children out of the workforce, lower the unemployment rate. It really wasn't to educate people at all. And I would say, at this point in time, education was just as bad as it is now, or worse. American education is deplorable for a developed country. And at this point in time, I think, when I was like child of the 80s, I think our education was pretty okay at that point. But at this point, in 2021, our education is at almost an all-time low. If you're aware of the public school systems and charter schools and all that. And the No Child Left Behind policy by George W. Bush is responsible for that, because the charter schools drained all the money out of public school system. So although they were trying to fix the school system, they made it worse with the No Child Left Behind policy by George W. Bush, the junior. Okay, so you had textbooks. History especially was created to foster patriotism. That became its main goal. This is why there's no talks about Native Americans, for example, or the truth about Native Americans. The California genocide and the Trail of Tears are left out completely almost. Teacher certification kept tight control of this. So you had, all the cogs in the system. These folks started becoming the cogs in the system: teachers, doctors, lawyers, administrators, politicians, to serve the interests of the wealthy, to serve the interests of the philanthropists. And then you have, at this point in time, you have the rise of socialism and communism. We're going to get to that. I don't think it's too much in this chapter. Okay, you have the new immigrants coming. So, I touched on that briefly in the beginning, but you have the new immigrant coming and changing the dynamic. And what the new immigrant did was it fragmented the working class on purpose. I mean, and when I mean on purpose, I mean the people on top wanted it that way, or they made it that way. So when the new immigrant came here, they were desperate as can be. Many came with no money at all. So they would work for anything. And the employers, the business executives, expected this and used it. So they knew they were helpless and controllable, culturally displaced, and at odds with each other. So they could use them as strike breakers. They could depress wages and basically drive the wages to, as low as that it can be. And so you had a many resistance movements coming as a flood of immigrants came. So 4 million came in 1890s, 5.5 million came in the 1880s. So, millions of people coming to America. Resistance movements were successful. So you had the Anarchist Congress in 1883, where they used Karl Marx and the workers of all lands unite. That's a quote from Communist Manifesto. You have New International Workers People Association, had 5,000 members. And what they were working for was an 8-hour workday movement. Many of these people were working 12-hour days and with no day off. So you had really this, think of it this way: as America reached the height of industry and economic growth, so do these resistant movements, because they grow at the same time as the industry is pushing and not allowing, folks to rest and not paying them enough. You have that kind of tension rising at the same time. And so you have the Haymaker Square bombing. And this is in 1885. Police were wounded, 66 police wounded. This was a massive bombing. And what you have now is anarchists and people were executed. Um, let's see. Yes, person and spies were blamed, plus 6 other anarchists, and they were put to death and executed. And at this point, I think it's a point. One of the most important moments or points to make in this moment in history is Emma Goldman. So Emma Goldman, she's going to come up a lot in this chapter, in this book, and this was her political awakening from the Haymaker affair. You have okay. Let's see if I can. I don't know if this is going to be 30 minutes, but I'll try. Okay, I'm probably already over. Okay, so you have labor uprisings in 1886. One of the things I mentioned is in the South, you had poor tenant farmers. So farmers really were devastated at this point in history. In the South in particular, they were tenant farmers or sharecroppers, where it was a perpetual endless loop of debt and you never got ahead. You were always in more and more and more debt. Um, and the poor whites in the South were similar to the blacks, is in the fact that none of them really owned land. And you had we talked about after the Civil War, you had the consolidation of land in the South and the North that, in a perfect world, it should have went to them. It should have went to the freed slaves. It should have went to the poor whites. But with the Homestead Act and all these other acts, really it benefited the wealthy. So you had a lot of these people in the South, a good amount of them were tenant farmers. They did not own their homes and living largely like the freed slaves. You had these strikes in response. You had organization. The Carnegie Steel Plan is an interesting, is a notable one where they laid off all the entire workforce in 1892. 4-month strike, agreed to return to work. Henry Frick, and he was Carnegie's basically Carnegie's, how would I say it? Carnegie's go-to guy, where you needed to get something bad done, you hired Henry Frick. Henry Frick was eventually attempt Emma Goldman's boyfriend had tried to kill him and did not succeed, Alexander Beckman. And so in the last class, I said 1873 was the first Great Depression. That was wrong. It's 1893. So my sincere apologies for that. 1873 was a huge shock, but not like 1893. So 1893, so before the Depression of 1929, 1893 was the Depression. It was huge. It was a really big deal. And this is largely, imagine, and we're kind of going through it now. So you go through this period of intense growth, industrial growth, financial manipulation, uncontrolled speculation and profiteering. And then eventually there's a reckoning. And so we've had it in many, in 2008 and 2000 in my lifetime, in the 80s. And I think coming very soon, we're going to have another one of, you have a correction. Someone say a market correction. I would call it a reckoning, where, for example, houses are worth $1 million right now. That's not the value of homes. So one day they're going to go back down. So at this point in 1893, you had 642 banks fail. You had 16,000 businesses close, 3 of the 15 million unemployed. So you had 20% unemployment rate. At this point, you have really Emma Goldman and all these other folks, Eugene Debs, these leaders of movements really speaking out. She was arrested for a race riot. You had the Pullman car strike. And what happened was they basically, Pullman Car Company was this company that owned all the box cars, or the cars that the railroad would use. And they would start burning them. And so Cleveland eventually sends federal troops in, and Debs gets 6 months. So, okay, you have socialism starting to rise. Eugene Debs was a socialist. I think he was the leader. Northern and Southern. You had the rebellion of farmers too. Farmers start rebellion from poor tenant farming. So basically, not only the industrial folks, but the farmers started rebelling and organizing. From 1860 to 1910, you had the Great Plains wiped out. Then all the natives in the Great Plains wiped out. You had the battle of Little Bighorn. You had Wounded Knee. You had the end of the Indian Wars in this period of time. And I would say, Indian portion and the Mexican American portion are not as, I would say those are the weaker parts of this book, but you can't do it all. So if you want those, I would go elsewhere. Um, if you want more on that. So population grew, farming grew. We talked about the mechanization. Okay. All right, let me just take a moment to read my notes. So, okay, the last thing I'll talk about is the People's Party. So you used to have America is a two-party system, but we've had moments in time where there's a third party, like the Whigs. And then you had the Whigs disappeared, right? And then you had two parties again, and then now you have a populist party. So the populist party arises out of all this stuff, going on. Um, Charles Mucane, I may not be saying his name right. He creates a third political party, and then they start getting elected. Excuse me. They start getting folks in legislation. Georgia was the most successful, um, and their motto, or I guess one of their main platforms of political platform, was this land being concentrated in the hands of the capitalists. So, for example, Donald Trump is a populist president, and some would say Bernie Sanders kind of is a populist president, but definitely Donald Trump. So populism is a political tradition that's in every society that's democratic, of course, and it comes up every once in a while, and then it kind of usually goes away. For example, Nazi Germany, fascism, Mussolini, those are populists, and they kind of play on the idea of the people, right? The popular. So this is the People's Party. They're talking about their ideas of fixing, the land concentration and uniting these diverse groups. So the Populist Party united the Northern Republicans, the Southern Democrats, the urban workers, country farmers, black, white. Equality rhetoric was not true, however, because blacks were still field hands and hired laborers, whites mostly farm owners. So just like today, politicians, populist politicians preach equality. They're working for everyone, but at the end of the day, it's never true. Black white unity made gains at some ballot box, but however, as one of the things you'll notice throughout the chapters is that this idea of divide and conquer is a political strategy. So as the black and white farmers were uniting, you had the Democratic Party and other folks, spreading seeds of dissent, and eventually that kind of would divide again and weaken the political power they would have had if they had solidarity. So you had also the beginning of voter suppression. Voter suppression was actually right after the Civil War, but it really started to take place in poll tax, literacy tests, etc., but also hurt poor whites in the South. Okay. So yeah, it basically talks about how the races almost connected in the South. It was almost going to happen with the populist like message, but it eventually failed. So race and class, always those two things that unfortunately um, are used against folks. So farmer and labor movements never united. What if they did? All right, and the last thing I want to do is have a quote. So as we mentioned, the populist movement failed to unite blacks and whites, city workers and country farmers, but they tried. And I think, we still try to do that every once in a while. where you try to unite these desperate groups that have the same goal and same problems, but it never really happens. And what happens is you get drowned in a two-party system where you lose independence. So one of the things Zinn talks about a lot in his book is how, um, and this is this really cool quote I like. Um, well, first of all, corporations funded adversaries of populist movements and elections. So the corporations, the people at the top, would basically sow seeds of dissent, because what they want least of all is for folks to unite and then take over the political scene. So here's a final quote I want to read. It was a time, as election times have often been in the United States, to consolidate the system after years of protest and rebellion. The blacks were under control in the South. The Indian was being driven off the Western plains for good. Wounded Knee, for example, was 1890. It was the climax to 400 years of violence that began with Columbus, establishing that this continent belonged to white men, but only to certain white men, because it was clear by 1896 that the state stood ready to crush labor strikes. And where a threatening mass movement developed, the two-party system stood ready to send one of its columns to surround that movement and drain it of its vitality. So, yeah, so I'll just end on that. That's food for thought again. We will continue this session or these book reviews, chapter 12, I'll probably do it on Wednesday. All right. So thank you very much, and I'll see you soon. Bye.